I approached her because I knew her and worked with her before, and she had been approached by an editor at Bullfinch Press who was interested in doing a book. So it all came together and was produced pretty quickly. But her feeling about why she wanted to do it and why she said yes to me was that she felt she needed it to help establish her credibility. Now, that's where we talk about different types of credibility. She's had many museum shows. She's represented by an important gallery. People write about her work all the time. It isn't as if she's hungry for attention, but she felt that the book would establish her in a more serious way. And it is a certain marker for an artist to have a book on their work. Certainly she's someone who is well established and was established before I became involved in working with her. But I think I contributed to more people knowing about her work and being interested in it. I talked about how generous she is and willing to share information, and I interviewed her for hours in several sessions. I waited till the last interview to ask her about her personal life, and when I started asking her questions specifically about her father, her reaction was to burst into tears and not want to answer my questions. I think one of the things I found out, not so much from her, but from people in the art community, is that the relationship with her father was a troubled one, that he was an alcoholic and that he could be violent. I don't want to exaggerate this or spread rumors, but that this was something that shaped her life and the life of her sisters. So I think some of her anxiety comes from the tensions that lie there, although I don't know it specifically or from her mouth. So she is a person who can be somewhat neurotic and have angst. Her life has gotten better in recent years, and the work has changed. That she went through a period of great tension and anxiety and psychological stress that she seems to have moved out of. And there's still some neurotic behavior, but she seemed happier. She was surrounded by a lot of powerful figures when she was young. Her father's friends were people like Jackson Pollock and Barnett Newman and Franz Klein, and so she was really surrounded by a lot of heavy hitters. It must have been intimidating to her. And she didn't pursue a conventional course. She didn't go to art school. She didn't get an MFA. She's a free spirit. And when she was younger, she had a lot of, sort of menial jobs, worked as a waitress. And she was 24 years old before she decided that she wanted to be an artist. So it took her a while to find herself. And her father died, in 1980. So that's about 20 years ago. And it was a liberating. It was obviously very sad, but also liberating for her in terms of making her work. She is someone who's more inclined to be experimental and to try lots of things, and if some succeed and some don't, that's okay. It's not a rigorous, it's not as rigorous as an approach. It's a more generous or open approach, and it's just her way. She is really following her own path and always has. She's a real independent, and people have come to her. She's not pandered to the audience. She creates something from a more internal place that the critics, the curators, the gallery owners have responded to. It's not about career or position. It's about the work itself, and I think that's part of the reason my interest in her and her work has been so sustained. It's a very honest endeavor. She would find no reason to do it otherwise. If it didn't have meaning for her, she wouldn't do it. The issue of beauty is one that's really been cast aside in recent work as being suspect, as being too seductive, as being something that you want to stay away from. That if you want your work to be tough or strong or meaningful, you have to eschew the idea of beauty. I think partly it's because the idea of beauty is has been defined in 19th century terms. Beautiful color, beautiful landscape, something that's meant to be soothing. I think it's the same thing that plays into the suspicion of contemporary art. If your idea of art is something more 19th century, is painting and sculpture, is something that's beautiful, soothing, elevating, then it's very hard to look at what's being done now and to admit for the range of possibilities. I think that for more contemporary artists, it was more that beauty was too restrictive a notion. You know, why was it incumbent on you to make something beautiful? You might want to tackle, you know, any number of tough or difficult subjects, like Kiki Smith does, and where beauty is not really the defining factor. A social issue, a political issue became much more important, and the way you made it was not as significant. I think something can be aesthetic and well put together without necessarily being the standard definition of beautiful. I would be hard-pressed to define beauty. I think most of us would at this point. I think for those of us who've looked at a lot of art, beauty becomes a much more flexible notion, that you can see beauty where you didn't expect to in the past, or in ways that are less conventional. I think for me it's not primary. It's never been primary, but the times when it's occurred, it can be incredibly satisfying. We were talking earlier about Anne Hamilton's project for Venice and how she decided to use this wall of pink powder as part of her piece. It was incredibly lovely and beautiful and satisfying as both a texture, a color, an experience. But it's not something that's necessarily associated with her work. She uses interesting materials and so forth, but it's almost a secondary concern. She wanted to add a sensual element to her work. I think that may be key to it too. Sensuality as much as beauty.
Yeah.
You know, that there's something that you want to feel or sense or touch or moves you emotionally or stimulates your senses in a certain way. And I think that, again, beauty is a narrow definition of that. It could happen in lots of ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I find when I look at a sculpture like Blood Pool, which is a portrait of agony in a way, I find that there's something beautiful about it too. That there's, it makes such a single strong statement that it's so coherent to me and effective in its use of materials, in its form, in the way it's presented, that there's a kind of beauty in the pain. So I see it there. She talks about engaging beauty more actively in recent work. There are elements that have become sort of more dazzling when she'll create these wonderful fields of both color, blue fields and red fields, where the color is really rich and sensual, and then add these beautiful sort of glittering elements like the stars, the frosted stars, the red glass tears, so that I think that she's engaged beauty more actively in her recent work. But I see it throughout in various ways. It's more overt, it's less fraught, it's less psychological now, but I think it was always there. New York is still the center, but there are really strong areas of activity elsewhere, you know, in major cities, Los Angeles or San Francisco or, you know, Houston or Chicago is a big center. There's a lot of art activity in Canada that's quite interesting. And so I think that there are areas of real energy and activity outside of New York. I think it holds a dominant position. It's where the most things are happening, where people expect the highest critical level to go on. And that has its pluses and minuses. That's its own sort of small world too. You know, are you inside of it or outside of it? I think that if you're working in the field, you can't ignore it. If you're working outside of it, I think it's nice to be able to tap into it from time to time, to visit, to see what's going on. Things travel much more too, both, you know, through magazines and internets, as well as exhibitions traveling, work traveling. There's a lot more of that happening. So I think it's much easier to keep yourself informed and active outside of the center. But I think it matters. There's a kind of critical mass that goes on that affects us. Even within the New York art world, there are various worlds. You know, at the area, there are a number of areas around Brooklyn, Williamsburg, and other areas where younger artists tend to gravitate. It's cheaper, it's more affordable, you can find a studio space. And then an art world sort of emerges around it. There are lots of smaller galleries there that are more experimental, show the work of younger artists. So it's a way in, you know, and then people in other spheres go and see what's happening there, and then those artists can possibly become integrated into the larger art scene. But you know, it's a place where young artists go and start their careers. You know, not in Soho anymore, but Dumbo or Williamsburg or places like that, where there's a possibility of getting studio space and getting yourself started and getting some recognition. And it happens. And there are also, you know, people in New York, collectors, curators, who are, you know, hungry for new ideas and will make the effort to seek out the artists who are there. What does it mean to reach an incredible mass audience the way American popular culture does in this country and around the world? And what does it mean to be an artist? You know, it's a much more intimate activity. It will never, except for a handful of artists who have seeped into the popular culture over the years, it will never be the same kind of visibility, the same level of visibility. There's something about, you know, the aesthetic experience. There's something about confronting a work of art yourself in the same space that can't be replicated, you know, in reproduction, in slides, in any way. Whereas popular culture is all about mass impact and mass appeal, and never about the sort of personal or direct interaction, where art almost always is, or where the best experience is to be had. There's a lot of talk and a lot of activity, you know, about the virtual museum, that what takes place will not be in a particular place and time, but will be disseminated electronically. And this is very exciting to a lot of people. I mean, there are some people who bemoan it because it's not the personal interaction that I was talking about, which I think some people would consider old-fashioned. But it's a way of communicating faster, much more broadly, and using new tools. It is more distanced, it's more abstracted, it's disembodied. It's all the things that the computer is in our life. Now it affords tremendous opportunity, which obviously hasn't been fully exploited. And I get back to what I said before. I think that we have to entrust it to the artists to find a way to use it that's meaningful, and not just as, you know, a lot of bells and whistles and exciting because it's new. It's okay, it's new. It offers you potential that you haven't had before. What are you as an artist going to do with it? And I think that that's where my hope lies, that there'll be serious and good artists who want to tackle this question, and that it won't be a repetition of what we've seen before. The role of the critic is important in the overall discussion, but doesn't dominate the way it once did during the time of a Greenberg or a Hilton Kramer or someone of that level.
Yeah.
I think the critics that seem to have the greatest sway are the ones who have the widest forum. You know, if you're a critic writing for the New York Times, like Roberta Smith, a lot of people read what you write, and you have a tremendous amount of influence. Your influence takes various forms. It influences the market reception of your work, as well as sort of a critical understanding of your work. It serves to establish credibility. The New York Times serves to establish credibility. I'm very conscious of the power of the New York Times, and just being noticed there, being well reviewed there, not being well reviewed. When I was curator for the United States Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 2 summers ago in '99 with a project by Anne Hamilton. We initially had a tremendously good profile of Anne done by Judy Dobrinsky, who is not an art editor. She does profiles of artists. And it was extremely positive. And this was just about 2 weeks before the project opened. So we had our expectations really high that all of our press would be good. And then when it was finally reviewed as an exhibition by Michael Kimmelman, he was entirely dismissive. In the New York, you know, the paper of record in the United States did not even bother to review the work. He just said it was a tremendous disappointment. That was it. Not why, not a review, not anything. It's, you know, it's a line and it devastates because everyone reads it. People make their decisions. Am I going to bother to go see it? Well, maybe not if Michael Kimmelman says no. So it's a tremendous force. We were talking about also Peter Plagians, who writes for Newsweek. There will be more people who read Newsweek than will ever read Art Forum or Art in America. Now, you don't get to write on the most critical or thoughtful level because your reviews are probably 500 words long, and it's got to be news and it's got to be lively. Robert Hughes, who I don't know if he's recovered yet, who writes for the Time magazine, is the single most read critic of all because of the distribution of Time magazine. More influence than anyone. So I think, you know, as a curator more than a critic, which I think I've said in some of these other sessions, I'm interested in how the word gets out and whether the word is thoughtful and makes any sense. It has a tremendous impact on the work you do. You know, will you draw an audience, and how dependent is that on how it's received in the local or national newspapers, and it's very dependent on that. It's always your responsibility as curator, if it's your project, that you're the one who has to write about it and speak for it because you're the one who knows it most intimately. If you work at a smaller institution, you generally do the fundraising yourself. And if anything, it's gotten more competitive because there are not that many outlets that people can go to. There's government support, and we all know that that's been reduced. You know, you can still go to the NEA or your state arts council or local arts council, and those are competitive funds. There are certain foundations that support the arts, that, like the Warhol Foundation, that everyone goes to and is highly competitive. And then there's individual support and corporate support. Corporate support is generally for more established figures. So if you're working for an institution that's not well endowed, you really have to get out there and beat the bushes. And it's tough. And without it, your project doesn't happen. So it's a key element in all of this. And I know that there are many directors, more than curators, whose job it is to fundraise. They spend the vast majority of their time doing that. The art world has become much more commercial. There's much more big money involved, and not just on the level of galleries selling art, but even in the museum field. I mean, it's very expensive to mount a big exhibition. Who can do it? What museum is big enough? Who'll pay for it? Who do you have to court to get it done? So it's become much more of a business-oriented than it has in the past. What are the motivations, you know, for people's interest in art? I think it's not always, some of it's pure. The artists make it, hopefully, from a sincere and honest place. The curators who show it are choosing artists that they truly believe in. The writers are writing about people they care about. But it's also, in our capitalist society, a very valuable commodity, you know, a fetish object. It's a symbol of your status. So there are also people who become involved on that level, which is very superficial and, to me, drains the value of art. That could be an individual collector, a corporation who's trying to polish their image, like the way Philip Morris uses art to, well, uses art. They support art, but they're using it to make themselves look like good corporate citizens, which of course they're not. So, you know, art can be shared and seen and enjoyed, and we talked about the hope, but it also can be used. And there's a lot of nonsense that goes on around that. I can see it in private collections when you walk into someone's home and you see an individual sensibility and an eye, and people talk about it with a certain commitment or passion. And when it looks like, or when it's, you know, a series of status symbols. You know, I have a Picasso, I have a Frank Stella, I have what everyone else told me I should have. I hear that phrase all the time in New York. This person buys art with their ears, by what people have told them is important. And I wouldn't say what the percentage, I don't know how much of that goes on, but that's also what can happen at the center, where it becomes not the art itself and not the quiet appreciation of it, but something that's traded. I think you get to a point where you trust yourself more. You know, when you're starting out or just studying art history, or studying art, you feel like you should try to know everything and see everything and respond to it all equally. And that's probably great because you're just kind of casting the wide net and taking in as much as you can. When you've worked in the field for a while, you start to see what's meaningful to you, and being more selective and realizing that in your own work, you really do need to focus. Whatever area you choose, whatever type of art you make or exhibitions you choose or books you write, that there's some part of it that's personal and yours. And that, for me, this interest in the body and gender has played an important role in probably the last 10 years of my work. I think that I'm probably in a transition now to what the next most interesting subject is going to be, because a lot of that, I think, has been played out pretty actively, and other ideas are popping up. But I think there's a certain pleasure in that, and trusting yourself and finding out what means the most to you. And I think I see it too working with artists. If sort of as I've worked for a number of years or worked with artists for a number of years, that at first there's a more tentative quality, and then they hit their stride, and there's something that's theirs. And that's when the work, probably not quite mid-career, but just before that, really becomes theirs. And it's a very individual process. I, for example, did an internship at the Whitney Museum to gain professional experience. And I found that was tremendously helpful. It doesn't apply, I guess, to artists per se, but people who are interested in museum work. It's a good way to get your foot in the door, to get some experience, and to develop some of the skills and confidence you need to enter the working world. Certainly in academic life, there's a much more clear course of further advanced study to get where you want to go. And for artists, I think artists are the bravest ones of all, because you're really taking a chance once you get out there. You really have to believe in yourself and be able to promote yourself and sustain your activity, often by doing work that has nothing to do with your own art. And that takes real guts. And I wish you well.